The blizzard hit Montana harder than any storm I had seen in 15 years, turning my 30,000 acres of wilderness into a white hellscape that would have killed anyone stupid enough to be out there without proper gear and knowledge of the land. I was sitting in my cabin, watching the snow pile up against the windows, when my phone buzzed with a notification from my property monitoring system. Someone was on my ATV trails, 3 miles deep into my land. The cameras showed a black Mercedes SUV stuck in a snowdrift, and a figure bundled in what looked like expensive ski gear stumbling around near one of my marked trail signs. I grabbed my winter gear, fired up my heavy-duty ATV with the heated grips and enclosed cab, and headed out into the storm. The temperature was dropping fast, already at -12 degrees, and the wind chill made it feel like -30. This person, whoever they were, had maybe an hour before hypothermia became a real problem. The ride out was brutal even with my equipment. I had built these trails over the past decade, carving them through my property for managing the land, checking on the wildlife, and occasionally guiding hunting parties during season. Every turn, every dip, every dangerous spot was burned into my memory. When I finally reached the stuck vehicle, I found a woman in her late 40s, red-faced and furious, yelling into her phone despite having no signal out here. "Excuse me," I called out over the wind. "You need to get inside, you are going to freeze to death." She spun around, her face contorted with rage rather than the fear or relief I expected. Finally, someone with authority. "I am Susan Whitmore, president of the Ridgeview Estates HOA, and I am out here documenting illegal ATV trails that are destroying our community's property values." I stared at her, genuinely confused. Ridgeview Estates was a new development about 8 miles from here, built 2 years ago on land that had been sold off by a neighboring ranch. "Madam, you are on private property, my private property. And you are going to die if you do not get somewhere warm in the next 30 minutes. Your property," she laughed, a shrill sound that cut through the wind. "These trails have been carved through HOA-protected wilderness. I have the documentation right here in my vehicle. You and every other reckless person who has been tearing up this land will be fined, and these trails will be restored to their natural state. Get in my ATV," I said firmly. "We can discuss this when you are not actively dying of exposure." "I am not going anywhere with you until you provide identification and proof that you have permission to be here," she snapped. "I have already contacted the sheriff about the illegal activity on this land." I pulled out my phone, which at least had the downloaded maps and property documents I kept for situations like this. "Madam, my name is Jacob Thornton. I own all 30,000 acres you are standing on, and those documents in your car are wrong. Now get in the ATV before I have to drag you." She snatched my phone from my hand, her expensive gloves making it difficult for her to navigate the screen. "This is fabricated. The HOA conducted a full survey of the area. This wilderness area was designated as community property, protected from development and motorized vehicles. You are the one trespassing." The situation was getting dangerous. The storm was intensifying, and I could see her starting to shiver despite her anger keeping her moving. "Susan, I am not arguing with you in a blizzard. Your survey is wrong. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. Now get in the vehicle, or I am calling search and rescue, and you can explain to them why you ignored evacuation warnings." "I did not ignore anything," she said, but I could hear her teeth starting to chatter. "The HOA board approved this inspection. We have responsibilities to our homeowners. These trails are creating erosion, disturbing wildlife, and setting a precedent that will destroy the pristine nature we promised our residents. I had dealt with plenty of difficult people in my life. Running a 30,000-acre ranch in Montana required dealing with hunters, government officials, environmental groups, and neighbors. But this woman was something else entirely. She genuinely believed she was right, even as the storm tried to kill her. "Your Mercedes is not getting out of that drift," I told her. "Even with a tow, not until this storm passes. You have two choices. Come with me to my cabin where it is warm, or stay here and freeze. I am not leaving you, so if you choose to stay, we both freeze." That finally got through to her. She grabbed a leather folder from her vehicle, locked it with her key fob as if anyone was going to steal it out here, and climbed into my ATV. The ride back was tense and silent except for the roar of the engine and the howling wind. She clutched that folder like it contained the secrets of the universe, occasionally shooting me glares that could have melted the snow around us. My cabin was built for harsh winters. Thick log walls, triple-paned windows, a massive stone fireplace, and enough supplies to last months if necessary. I ushered her inside and pointed to the bathroom. "There are towels and spare clothes in there. Get out of those wet things before you get hypothermia for real." She hesitated, clearly not wanting to accept my help, but survival instincts finally won over stubbornness. While she was changing, I made coffee and started going through my own property documents. I had a feeling this was going to be a long night, and I wanted my evidence organized. When she emerged wearing my spare thermal clothes that were far too big for her, she looked slightly less like an ice sculpture and slightly more human. I handed her a mug of coffee. "Thank you," she said stiffly, then immediately went back on the attack. "But this does not change the facts. The Ridgeview Estates, HOA, has legal documentation that this area, specifically the corridor where those ATV trails are located, falls within our protected wilderness zone. Our residents paid premium prices for homes with guaranteed access to pristine nature. Your trails are a violation of that guarantee." I pulled out my laptop and brought up the county property records. "Susan, who sold you that information? Who did your survey?" "Our developer, Richard Steinberg, hired a professional surveying company," she said defensively. "Everything was verified by the county before our first homes were sold. I have lived in Ridgeview Estates for 18 months, and I have served as HOA president for the past year. Part of my responsibility is protecting our investment and our quality of life." "Pull up your map," I said, turning my laptop so she could see it. "Let me see what you are working with." She opened her leather folder and spread out several documents. The main one was an impressive-looking survey map with the Ridgeview Estates development clearly marked, along with various zones labeled as protected wilderness, community common areas, and private lots. The problem was immediately obvious to me. The map showed the protected wilderness extending about 3 miles beyond the actual development boundaries, encompassing a significant chunk of my land. "This map is wrong," I said flatly. "Look at the county records. Here are the GPS coordinates of my property boundaries. They have been registered since 1952 when my grandfather bought this land. Here are the tax records showing continuous ownership and payment. Here is the survey conducted when I built this cabin in 2010. Your protected wilderness does not exist." Susan's face was turning red again, but this time from anger rather than cold. "That is impossible. We paid for a professional survey. The county approved our HOA charter based on these boundaries." "Are you suggesting that Richard Steinberg, a respected developer with projects across 3 states, committed fraud?" "I am suggesting your survey company made a massive mistake, or someone lied to you about where your boundaries actually are," I said. "Either way, you do not own the land my trails are on. You never did. And you sure as hell do not have the authority to fine me or tell me what I can do on my own property. She grabbed her phone. I am calling Richard right now. You do not have signal out here, I reminded her. The storm is blocking everything. You can try my satellite phone if you want, but it is going to be an expensive call. Fine, she snapped. Give it to me. I handed over my satellite phone and watched as she dialed with shaking fingers. The call connected, and I could hear a man's voice answer, confused about the unknown number. Richard, this is Susan Whitmore. I am stuck on the protected wilderness property during the blizzard, and there is a man here claiming he owns all of it. He is saying our survey is wrong. I need you to explain to him that the HOA has full legal authority over this land. I could not hear his response clearly, but I saw Susan's face go from confident to confused to pale in the span of about 30 seconds. What do you mean you will have to check? The survey was approved. You showed us the maps. We based our entire marketing campaign on that wilderness access. More silence as she listened. No, I am not accusing you of anything. I am stuck in a blizzard and I need answers. This man is Jacob Thornton, and he is showing me county records that say he owns everything. There was a long pause, then I heard the tone of the voice on the other end change. Susan's hand started to tremble. I see. And when were you planning to tell the HOA board about this discrepancy? Right. No, I understand. I will contact you when the storm passes. She hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. When she finally looked at me, some of the fire had gone out of her eyes. Richard says there may have been an error in the initial survey. He is looking into it. An error, I repeated. Susan, your entire development is built on the promise of protected wilderness that does not belong to you. That is not an error. That is fraud. We do not know that yet, she said quickly. It could be a legitimate mistake. Boundary disputes happen all the time. I am sure once the lawyers review everything, we will find that there is shared ownership or easement rights or something that protects the HOA's interests. I shook my head. There is no shared ownership. There are no easement rights. My family has owned this land outright for 74 years. Before that, it was federal land that was sold off to homesteaders. The chain of title is clear and unbroken. Your HOA was sold a fantasy. She sat down heavily on my couch, still clutching her folder. This is going to destroy our property values. People bought in Ridgeview Estates specifically because of the wilderness access. We advertised it. It is in all of our marketing materials. Some residents bought ADVs specifically to access the trails, not knowing they were yours. Wait, I said. Other people from your HOA have been on my trails. Of course, she said. We thought they were community trails. We even put up some signs last fall directing people to the best routes for wildlife viewing. That explained the strange markers I had found and removed from my property. I had assumed it was just confused tourists. Susan, you have been directing your residents to trespass on my land, repeatedly. Do you understand how serious that is? It was not trespassing if we genuinely believed it was our land, she argued, some of her fire returning. At worst, it is a civil matter. A boundary dispute that needs to be resolved through proper legal channels. It is trespassing the moment I tell you to stay off my land, which I am doing right now, I said firmly. As of this moment, you and every member of your HOA are officially notified that this is private property, and you do not have permission to be here. She stood up, drawing herself to her full height, despite being swallowed by my oversized clothes. I am going to have to consult with our HOA attorney. We may have adverse possession claims given how long we have been using the trails. We may have prescriptive easement rights. And we certainly have a cause of action against Richard Steinberg if he misrepresented the property boundaries. Adverse possession requires years of open and notorious use without the owner's permission, I said. Your HOA has existed for 2 years, and I have been using these trails for 10. You do not have a case, but you are right about one thing. You definitely have a case against your developer. The storm raged outside, making the windows rattle. We were stuck together until it passed, which according to the weather reports could be another 12 to 18 hours. Susan sat back down, looking deflated. I moved to Ridgeview Estates because it was supposed to be perfect. A real community with standards and rules. Protection from the chaos and ugliness you see in so many places. I have worked so hard as HOA president to maintain those standards. You know how difficult it is to get people to follow simple rules. To keep their lawns maintained, their paint colors approved, their holiday decorations tasteful. I would not know, I said. I live out here specifically to avoid that kind of thing. Of course you do, she said bitterly. You have 30,000 acres. You can do whatever you want. But the rest of us have to live in communities with other people. We have to have rules, or everything falls apart. There is a difference between community rules and claiming you own land that belongs to someone else, I pointed out. Your HOA can enforce whatever rules you want within your actual development, but you crossed a line when you came onto my property and tried to tell me what to do. She was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee. I genuinely thought I was doing the right thing. The trails were getting worse, more torn up. I was worried about erosion, about wildfire access, about liability if someone got hurt. I thought I was protecting our community. By doing what exactly? I asked. What was your plan once you documented the trails? We were going to issue fines to anyone caught using them, she admitted. And we were going to file for a restraining order to prevent further damage. Our attorney said we had a strong case based on the environmental impact and the violation of our HOA covenants. Your HOA covenants do not extend to my property, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Susan, you could have checked the county records before going through all of this. You could have knocked on my door and asked questions. Instead, you drove into a blizzard to document violations on land you do not own. I did check the records, she insisted. I pulled up the county GIS system and looked at the property lines. They matched our survey map. The wilderness area was clearly marked as part of the Ridgeview Estates protected zones. That made me pause. Show me. She pulled out her phone, frustrated that she still had no signal. I cannot access it without internet. Use my laptop, I said. It has satellite internet. She navigated to the county's online GIS system and pulled up the map. I looked over her shoulder, and my jaw tightened. Someone had definitely manipulated the data. The property lines shown on the county's public mapping system did not match the official recorded surveys. My property was shown as being about 8,000 acres, with the rest absorbed into a vaguely defined protected zone associated with Ridgeview Estates. That is not right, I said. Someone has tampered with the public GIS system. The recorded surveys on file with the county clerk are different. Let me pull those up. It took some digging, but I found the official recorded plats and surveys. They clearly showed my 30,000 acres with no ambiguity. The GIS system had been altered, probably by someone at the developer's office who had access to submit map updates. It was a clever scheme. Most people would look at the online maps and assume they were accurate. Only someone who went to the physical records would find the truth. Susan, you have been defrauded, I said. Richard Steinberg or someone working for him altered the public mapping system to make it look like your HOA-controlled land that it does not. This is not a mistake. This is deliberate. She stared at the screen, her face going through a series of expressions. Shock, denial, anger, and finally, a cold determination. I need to contact our attorney immediately, and the rest of the HOA board. If Richard Steinberg defrauded us, then every homeowner in Ridgeview Estates has grounds for a lawsuit. Our property values are based on representations that were false. You should also contact the county, I added. Altering the official GIS system is probably a crime, and you should contact the other homeowners before they keep trespassing on my land and I have to start pressing charges. You would not, she said, but there was no heat in it. She looked exhausted. They are just families trying to enjoy the outdoors. They do not know they are trespassing. And now you know, so you need to tell them, I said. Look, I am not trying to be the bad guy here. I understand you were lied to. But this is my land, and I have liability concerns too. If someone gets hurt on my property without permission, I could be sued. I need your HOA to stop sending people onto my trails. She nodded slowly. I will send out an emergency notification as soon as the storm passes and I can get signal. And I will call an emergency board meeting to discuss legal action against Steinberg Development. We spent the rest of the evening in an awkward truce. I made dinner while Susan worked on her laptop, drafting emails and reviewing the HOA's purchase documents. She was meticulous, I had to give her that. Every communication was carefully worded, every claim backed up with documentation. Around 10 at night, she finally closed her laptop and rubbed her eyes. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I came onto your property, accused you of crimes, threatened you with fines and legal action, and got myself stuck in a blizzard in the process. You saved my life and I repaid you by being a complete nightmare. I am sorry. Apology accepted, I said. For what it is worth, I think you genuinely believed you were doing the right thing. You were just working with bad information. That is not really an excuse, she said. I should have been more thorough. I should have questioned Richard when he gave us the surveys. I should have hired an independent surveyor to verify everything. I was just so excited about the community we were building that I did not do my due diligence. Learn from it, I suggested, and use that energy to go after the person who actually lied to you. She managed a small smile. Oh, I intend to. Richard Steinberg is going to regret the day he decided to defraud the Ridgeview Estates HOA. The storm finally broke around dawn. The world outside was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, with drifts up to 6 feet in places. My ATV could handle it, but Susan's Mercedes was going to need a serious tow truck. I made breakfast while Susan used my satellite phone to start making calls. First to her husband, who had apparently been frantic with worry. Then to the other HOA board members. Then to their attorney. I could only hear her side of the conversations, but it was clear she was assembling an army. By the time she finished, she had authorized the HOA attorney to begin a full investigation into Steinberg Development, scheduled an emergency meeting for that evening, and arranged for a professional surveyor to verify the true property boundaries at the HOA's expense. My husband is coming to pick me up, she told me. He has a 4-wheel drive truck, and I have arranged for a towing company to get my Mercedes once the roads are clearer. Thank you for everything, Jacob. The shelter, the food, the patience. I know I did not make it easy. Just do me a favor and keep your residents off my trails until this gets sorted out, I said. I do not want anyone getting hurt, and I do not want to have to start posting no trespassing signs all over my land. I am sending out the notification right now, she said, typing on her phone. And I will personally visit every household that I know has used the trails to explain the situation. This is my responsibility to fix. Her husband arrived about an hour later, a tall man with worried eyes who hugged Susan like he thought he might never see her again. Tom Whitmore, he introduced himself, shaking my hand. Thank you for taking care of my wife. When I heard she had driven out into the blizzard, I thought I had lost her. She is tougher than she looks, I said, but yeah, it was close. Another hour and we would have had real problems. I have been telling her for months that the HOA was consuming her life, Tom said. Maybe this will be a wake-up call. Susan shot him a look. The HOA needed someone to take it seriously. Most of the board just wanted to collect dues and approve paint colors. I was trying to build something meaningful. By hiking 3 miles into a blizzard to document ATV trails, Tom said dryly. Very meaningful. They left shortly after, with Susan promising to keep me updated on the legal situation. I watched them drive away, then spent the rest of the day digging out and checking my property for damage. The storm had knocked down a few trees and buried some of my fencing, but overall everything had survived intact. My ATV trails were barely visible under the fresh snow, peaceful and pristine. It was hard to believe that just yesterday they had been the center of a potential legal war. Over the next week, things moved fast. Susan kept her promise and sent out detailed notifications to all Ridgeview Estates residents explaining the situation. She held the emergency board meeting and got unanimous approval to pursue legal action against Steinberg Development. The HOA hired a forensic surveyor who confirmed what I had been saying. The 30,000 acres were mine, and the GIS system had been deliberately altered to show otherwise. The county launched an investigation into how their system had been compromised, and Susan provided them with all of the HOA's documentation. Richard Steinberg, when confronted with the evidence, tried to claim it was an honest mistake by his surveying contractor. But when the county investigator pulled the records, they found a pattern. Steinberg had used similar tactics on 2 other developments, slightly inflating the size of protected areas and common lands by encroaching on neighboring properties. In each case, the amounts were small enough that the neighbors had not noticed or had not bothered to fight it. But in Ridgeview Estates, he had gotten greedy, trying to absorb nearly 20,000 acres of my land into his marketing scheme. Susan called me about 2 weeks after the blizzard. I wanted to give you an update. The county prosecutor is filing charges against Richard Steinberg for fraud, forgery of public documents, and criminal trespass. Our HOA is also filing a civil suit for fraud, misrepresentation, and violation of real estate disclosure laws. And about 40 individual homeowners are joining a class action against him for the loss in property values. How are your neighbors taking it? I asked. Mixed reactions, she admitted. Some are furious at Richard, some are furious at me for exposing the problem. A few have accused me of being too aggressive and destroying the value of their investments, but most understand that it is better to know the truth now than to keep living in a fantasy that would have eventually collapsed anyway. Are you still HOA president? I asked. For now, she said. There is going to be a recall vote in a few months. Some residents blame me for not catching this sooner. They think I should have done more due diligence before taking actions based on the survey. They are probably right. You were working with the information you had, I said. And when you found out it was wrong, you fixed it. That is all anyone can do. Thank you, she said quietly. That means a lot coming from you. Listen, I have a proposal. The HOA has about 15 acres of actual common land on the edge of our development. It is mostly wooded, with some trails that we have maintained. Would you be willing to grant an easement to our residents to access your trails through that common land? We would pay for it, obviously, and we would sign whatever liability waivers you want. But it would give our residents at least some of the wilderness access they were promised, even if it is not technically on HOA land. I thought about it. I am not interested in money, but I would consider it under the right conditions. Your HOA would be responsible for maintaining the access point and making sure your residents follow rules. No littering, no disturbing wildlife during nesting season, no fires, speed limits on the trails. And I reserve the right to close access during hunting season or if there are safety concerns. That is more than fair, Susan said. I will draw up a proposal and send it to you for review. And Jacob, thank you. You could have made this so much worse for us. You could have pressed charges for trespassing, sued for damages, made our lives miserable. Instead, you are giving us a chance to salvage something good from this disaster. I am not interested in punishing people who were lied to, I said. I just want to protect my land and my rights. If we can find a way to do that while also giving your residents some access to the outdoors, that is a win for everyone. The easement took about 3 months to finalize. Susan was true to her word, hiring attorneys to draft an agreement that protected both sides. The HOA paid for professional trail markers, installed a gate system that I could control remotely, and set up an education program for residents on proper outdoor ethics. In exchange, I granted access to about 50 miles of my trail network, with clear boundaries marked on maps that were distributed to every household. I kept the areas closest to my cabin and my critical wildlife corridors completely private, but there was more than enough room for the Ridgeview Estates residents to enjoy without impacting my life or my land management. The legal case against Richard Steinberg took longer. The criminal charges moved through the system slowly, with Steinberg hiring expensive lawyers who filed motion after motion to delay and dismiss. But the evidence was overwhelming. The altered GIS records, the pattern of similar behavior in other developments, the testimony from the surveying companies he had pressured to falsify reports. In the end, he took a plea deal. 5 years of probation, a $200,000 fine, restitution to the Ridgeview Estates HOA and homeowners, and a permanent ban from working in real estate development in Montana. The civil suits resulted in a settlement that gave each homeowner about $30,000 in compensation, and the HOA recovered most of what they had paid for the protected wilderness they had never actually received. Susan ended up surviving the recall vote, though it was closer than she expected. Some residents appreciated her aggressive pursuit of justice. Others felt she should have been more careful before the blizzard incident. She told me she had learned to pick her battles more carefully and to verify everything before taking action. The experience had humbled her, which was probably a good thing. She was still intense and detail-oriented, but now she channeled that energy into things the HOA actually controlled, like community events and maintaining the common areas. She stopped trying to police the world beyond her jurisdiction. About 6 months after the blizzard, I was out checking fence lines on the northern edge of my property when I saw a small group of riders on ATVs. They were on my trails, but they were clearly from Ridgeview Estates, following the marked route and staying within the boundaries. I watched them for a while, making sure they were respecting the rules. They stopped at one of the scenic overlooks, took photos, and had a picnic lunch. They packed out all their trash, stayed on the trails, and were gone within an hour. It was exactly what responsible use looked like. As I turned to head back to my cabin, my phone rang. It was Susan. "Jacob, I wanted to let you know that we just finished installing the last of the interpretive signs along the trail system. They explain the history of the land, the wildlife that lives here, and the rules for respectful use. I am emailing you photos if you want to approve them before we consider the project complete." "I trust your judgment," I said. You have done a good job with this, Susan. Your residents are lucky to have someone who cares as much as you do. Even when I care a little too much and almost freeze to death in a blizzard, she asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Even then, I said, you made a mistake, but you owned it and fixed it. That is rare these days. Well, I learned from the best, she said. You could have been vindictive. You could have made us suffer for our ignorance and our trespassing. Instead, you gave us a chance to make it right. That is not something I will forget. We talked for a few more minutes about maintenance schedules and upcoming trail closures for hunting season. It was a normal, productive conversation between two people who had figured out how to coexist. When I hung up, I looked out over my land, the 30,000 acres that had been in my family for generations. The snow was starting to melt, revealing the trails I had built with my own hands, the forests I had protected, the wildlife I had nurtured. It was mine, legally and morally, and now everyone knew it. But I had also learned something from the experience. Land ownership was not just about keeping people out. It was about stewardship, about making choices that benefited the land and the community around it. By opening a small portion of my property to the Ridgeview Estates residents, I had not diminished my ownership. I had actually strengthened it by building relationships and goodwill with my neighbors. That summer, I ran into Susan at a community meeting in town about wildfire preparedness. She was there representing the HOA, asking informed questions about evacuation routes and fire break maintenance. When she saw me, she waved and came over during the break. "How are the trails holding up?" she asked. "Any problems with our residents?" "None at all," I said. "Everyone has been respectful. I have seen a few families out there, some couples, even some solo hikers. They follow the rules and they seem to genuinely appreciate the access." "That is good to hear," she said. "We have had a few people request access to additional areas, but I have been firm about the boundaries. The agreement says 50 miles of designated trails, and that is what they get. If they want more, they need to respect that it is your decision, not theirs." "I appreciate that," I said. "Maybe in a few years, if things keep going well, I will consider opening up some more areas, but for now I am happy with how things are working." She nodded. I learned my lesson about pushing too hard too fast. Patience and respect go a lot further than demands and entitlement. The meeting resumed, and we both took our seats. As I listened to the fire marshal talk about defensible space and emergency protocols, I thought about how much had changed since that blizzard. A woman who had driven onto my land to issue fines and threaten legal action had become a reasonable neighbor and even something like a friend. An HOA that I had initially seen as an enemy had become a partner in land stewardship. And I had learned that protecting my rights did not mean I had to be isolationist or hostile. Sometimes the best way to defend what was yours was to find common ground with the people around you. The prosecutor's office called me a few times during the Steinberg case to verify details and provide testimony. I spent an afternoon in a deposition, walking through the timeline of discovering the altered GIS records and explaining the impact on my property rights. The attorney prosecuting the case was a sharp woman named Patricia Hendricks, and she was building an ironclad case. "Mr. Thornton, your testimony is crucial," she told me. "Steinberg's defense is going to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that the surveying errors were honest mistakes. But your documentation proves that the alterations were deliberate and systematic. Without your records, we would have a much weaker case." "Happy to help," I said. "What he did was not just wrong, it was dangerous." If Susan had not confronted me in that blizzard, if we had not figured out the truth, who knows how long this fraud would have continued? How many more people would have bought property based on false promises? Exactly, Patricia said. And that is why we are pushing for significant penalties. This was not a victimless crime. Every homeowner in Ridgeview Estates has suffered financial harm. The county has spent thousands of dollars investigating and correcting the GIS system, and you had to deal with repeated trespassing and threats based on fraudulent documents. Steinberg needs to face consequences. The day of Steinberg's sentencing, I drove to the courthouse in Missoula. Susan was there with several other members of the HOA board, along with about 20 homeowners who had taken the day off work to see justice done. Steinberg looked smaller than I expected, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who kept whispering urgently to his lawyer. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he stood and gave a prepared statement about how sorry he was, how he had made mistakes under pressure to deliver results, how he never meant to harm anyone. It rang hollow. The judge was not impressed. "Mr. Steinberg, you are a licensed real estate developer with decades of experience. You knew exactly what you were doing when you altered those property records. You knew you were defrauding your customers. You knew you were violating Mr. Thornton's property rights. And you kept doing it in project after project because it was profitable. The only reason you are sorry is because you got caught. This court sentences you to 5 years of supervised probation with the conditions outlined in your plea agreement. Additionally, I am imposing a special condition that you must perform 500 hours of community service, specifically working with a land trust or conservation organization so you can learn the value of ethical land stewardship." Court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, reporters interviewed Susan and some of the other homeowners. I tried to slip away, but Patricia Hendricks caught up with me. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Thornton. This case would not have been possible without your documentation and your willingness to stand up for your rights." "I just told the truth," I said. "Steinberg did this to himself. More people should have your attitude," she said. "Too often, victims of property fraud just accept it because fighting back seems too expensive or too difficult. You showed that it is worth fighting for what is right." As I drove back to my cabin that evening, I felt a sense of closure. Justice had been served, the truth had been established, and my property rights had been vindicated. But more than that, I had discovered that standing up for yourself did not have to mean standing alone. Susan and the HOA residents had become allies once they understood the real situation. The county prosecutor had been eager to pursue the case because it affected the integrity of public records. Even the media coverage had been fair, focusing on the fraud rather than framing it as a rich landowner versus a struggling HOA. When you had truth and law on your side, people would listen. The years that followed were peaceful. The trail access agreement with Ridgeview Estates worked well, with only a handful of minor incidents that were quickly resolved. Susan eventually stepped down as HOA president after serving 3 terms, but she remained active in the community. We occasionally crossed paths at town meetings or local events, and the conversations were always friendly. She had become an advocate for property rights and ethical development, serving on a county planning commission and pushing for stricter oversight of surveying practices. The blizzard that had nearly killed her had transformed her from an overzealous HOA enforcer into a thoughtful community leader. I like to think our encounter had played a role in that transformation. My 30,000 acres remained my sanctuary. I continued to maintain the trails, manage the wildlife, and live the life I had always wanted. The difference was that now I was not alone in caring for the land. The Ridgeview Estates residents who used the trails had become invested in protecting them. They reported problems, volunteered for maintenance days, and educated newcomers about responsible use. What had started as a conflict over property rights had evolved into a genuine partnership in land stewardship. It was not what I had expected, but it was better than I could have hoped for. On the anniversary of the blizzard, Susan called me. "I know this might sound strange, but I wanted to thank you again for that day. I have been thinking about how differently things could have gone. If you had not come to get me, if you had not been patient while I figured out the truth, if you had not been willing to work with us after everything, my life would be very different, probably shorter." "You are welcome," I said, "though I still think you were crazy for driving out into that storm." "Oh, absolutely," she laughed. "It was the stupidest thing I have ever done, but it led to something good, even if it took a near-death experience to get there. I learned that being right is not the same as having all the answers. And I learned that sometimes the people you think are your enemies are actually the ones who will save your life." "Heavy thoughts for a Thursday afternoon," I said. "I have a lot of time to think now that I am not obsessing over HOA violations," she said. "Tom says I am much easier to live with, though he still brings up the blizzard incident every time I suggest we should buy a more powerful snowblower or install heated driveways in the common areas." We talked for a while longer about nothing in particular. The weather, the upcoming hunting season, a proposal to expand the volunteer trail maintenance program. It was comfortable, the kind of conversation you have with someone who has earned your respect through shared challenges. When we hung up, I walked out onto my porch and looked out at the mountains. The trails stretched out before me, carved through the wilderness I had protected for decades. Some of those trails now carried families from Ridgeview estates, people experiencing the beauty of Montana under conditions I had carefully established. It was not what I had planned when I first built those trails, but it felt right. The land was still mine, but its impact reached beyond my boundaries. That was a legacy worth protecting. Years later, when I was considerably older and starting to think about what would happen to my property after I was gone, I met with an attorney to discuss conservation easements and land trusts. The goal was to ensure that the 30,000 acres would remain protected, that future owners could not subdivide or develop it into another Ridgeview Estates. During those meetings, I made sure to include provisions for the trail access agreement. The partnership with the HOA residents had become an important part of how the land was used and valued. Future generations deserved the chance to experience that same connection to the wilderness, under the same careful stewardship that had made it work. The attorney, a young woman named Michelle Barnes, was impressed by the arrangement. It is rare to see a private landowner and an HOA working together like this. Usually, these situations end up in court with both sides spending a fortune on litigation. It almost did end that way, I admitted, telling her the story of Susan and the blizzard. But we both chose to look for solutions instead of just fighting. It made all the difference. That kind of practical wisdom should be preserved along with the land, Michelle said. I am going to make sure the conservation easement includes the history of how this access agreement came to be. Future trustees need to understand that this was not just a legal arrangement. It was a relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. As I signed the documents that would protect my land long after I was gone, I thought about that day in the blizzard when a furious woman had climbed into my ATV, convinced she was in the right and I was the villain. Neither of us had known that encounter would change both of our lives, that it would lead to friendship, partnership, and a model for how neighbors could coexist even when their interests seemed opposed. The trails that had nearly sparked a legal war had instead become bridges between my isolated acres and the community beyond. and the woman who had claimed my property was destroying her HOA's values had become one of the land's most effective defenders. The Montana wilderness did not care about property lines or HOA covenants or legal disputes. It had existed long before any of us and would continue long after we were gone. Our job, as temporary stewards, was to protect it while also allowing people to experience its power and beauty. That balance was delicate and required constant attention, but when done right, it created something more valuable than ownership alone could achieve. It created legacy, connection, and meaning that transcended any individual's claim to the land. The blizzard had taught me that lesson in the harshest possible way. But like the land itself, I had survived and grown stronger because of it.